The first images reached the expedition vessel Artemis long before the divers resurfaced. Grainy silhouettes flickered across the monitors in the control room, rounded shapes scattered across the ocean floor, strangely uniform in height each, outlined by soft halos of drifting sediment. At first glance, they resembled coral outgrowths or sections of a collapsed reef, but the metal glint beneath the greenish coating told another story entirely. No one on board had expected this. The mission's purpose had been routine seabed mapping along an isolated corridor of the North Atlantic Ridge. What the cameras revealed instead was an enigma. Bicycles, entire rows of bicycles embedded into the seafloor and covered in thick oceanic sponge dot. The discovery stunned everyone. Even in the world of oceanographic research, where the bizarre is common enough to dull surprise, the sight of human bicycles arranged neatly at a depth of nearly 3,000 meters defied all logic. They appeared as if someone had placed them there deliberately, each one standing upright, each one crusted in an almost luminous coat of sponge, moss green and golden in the beams of the underwater drones. Some frames had eroded into skeletal outlines. Others, protected by the sponge, looked nearly intact except for the heavy burden of years resting on them. The water around them was unusually still, as though the currents themselves hesitated to disturb this silent gallery of forgotten machines. Dr. Lena Arkwright, the mission's lead marine archaeologist, leaned closer to the screen, her hands braced on the console. The more detail the remote cameras captured, the stranger the scene became. These were not modern bicycles, nor were they primitive relics from the earliest days of cycling. They were an uncanny blend of styles, as if taken from different eras' wire-spoked wheels, reminiscent of the early 20th century, frames suggestive of mid-century touring models, handlebars shaped like those from decades past, yet altered by corrosion into organic curves. But the real puzzle was the sponge. It draped each bicycle completely, as if grown intentionally to preserve the shape of every mechanical line. The first group of divers reached the site after 20 minutes of descent. Their lamps pierced the darkness like wandering stars drifting downward, illuminating swirls of particles suspended in the cold water. As their boots touched the seabed, faint clouds lifted and settled again. The bicycles rose around them like eerie monuments, arranged in a curving path that snaked deeper into the trench. There was an unsettling artistry to their placement, a silent symmetry that none of the divers could dismiss as coincidence. In the stillness of the deep, the rows of sponge-coated bicycles looked almost ritualistic. Communication between the divers and the Artemis crackled with static, but Dr. Arkwright caught the astonished whisper of the lead diver, Marcus Hawley. "It's like a cemetery down here." She understood the sentiment immediately. Each bicycle, cocooned in sponge, resembled a fossil frozen mid-motion, a suggestion of movement forever suspended in time. The sponge itself was not the typical kind that clung to shipwrecks or submerged debris. It was dense, uniform, unusually thick, and displayed a subtle bioluminescent sheen under the divers' lights, giving the bicycles an otherworldly glow. When Marcus brushed a gloved hand against one frame, the sponge shifted like living velvet, revealing rusted metal underneath, before slowly puffing back into place. Samples were collected gingerly. The sponge reacted slightly to contact, shrinking as though contracting in self-protection. No one had encountered a species quite like it, and the biology team aboard the Artemis began preparing for analysis, even before the divers began their ascent. While the team examined each bicycle, taking note of the spacing, the condition of the metal, and the nature of the sponge, a larger mystery loomed. How had these objects come to rest here, in a trench miles from the nearest shipping route? There was no record of cargo spills involving bicycles, nor any undersea currents that could have carried such items across such distances. The question became even more perplexing as the divers followed the line of bicycles farther along the ridge. They were not scattered randomly. They formed a gentle curve, almost a procession, sloping toward a deeper fold in the ocean floor dot at the end of the path. The divers found something even stranger, a large outcropping of rock shaped like an amphitheater, its central basin filled with sponge-covered objects whose outlines were obscured. Only by focusing their lights could the divers distinguish that some of these objects were bicycle parts, wheels, sprockets, pedals, while others were unrecognizable. The basin seemed to function as a kind of natural cradle where currents had deposited debris, but the orderly arrangement suggested intentional placement rather than chaotic collapse. The divers returned to the surface with dozens of high-definition images. Dr. Arkwright studied each one carefully. The sponge's growth patterns were symmetrical, forming ridges that matched the bicycle's contours precisely, almost sculptural in their precision. She hypothesized that the sponge species had evolved to colonize metallic structures, feeding off trace minerals, but that did not explain the presence of the bicycles themselves. A theory emerged during the evening briefing. One of the oceanographers suggested that the site might have been a forgotten dumping ground from the mid-1900s, when waste was occasionally disposed of offshore. But the depth made this unlikely. Equipment of that era could not have transported cargo this far down. Another theory proposed a long-lost vessel carrying bicycles for trade, swallowed by a storm and crushed into the trench. But the linear arrangement contradicted the chaotic pattern expected from a shipwreck dot late that night. As the crew examined the retrieved specimens under microscopes and spectrometers, the sponge's secrets began to unravel. Its cellular structure was unlike any documented Atlantic species. Its fibers contained microchannels lined with iron-loving bacteria that flourished in the presence of oxidized metal. The sponge had not merely grown on the bicycles, it had adapted to them, enveloping each component in a protective sheath that slowed corrosion. In an odd twist of biology, the sponge had become a guardian of the metal rather than a destroyer of it. This realization sparked a new hypothesis. Perhaps the bicycles had been resting there far longer than anyone assumed. If the sponge preserved, rather than consumed the metal, the bicycles could have been centuries old, far older than the technology they represented. Such an idea bordered on the impossible. Yet the ocean often held contradictions that defied expectation. The next morning, the divers embarked on another descent, this time with specialized equipment for excavation and more powerful lights. Their descent traced the same path, and as they approached the amphitheater-like formation, an unexpected current swept across the ridge. It stirred the sediment violently, revealing new shapes buried beneath the sponge. For a moment, the visibility dropped to almost zero. Then, as the current passed, the divers found themselves staring at a massive, half-buried structure dot. It resembled the remains of a large cargo container, severely deformed by pressure and time. Its steel ribs bent in grotesque curves, and its outer surfaces were nearly unrecognizable under the layers of sponge. If this was indeed the source of the bicycles, the mystery deepened rather than resolved. The container seemed impossibly old, its metal fatigued in ways that suggested centuries. Underwater, yet bicycles had not existed for so long. Marcus radioed the surface immediately, his voice tight with awe. "We've found a container. Or what's left of one. But it doesn't make sense. This thing looks ancient." Dr. Arkwright ordered additional scans. The sonar images that followed revealed a debris field extending far beyond what the divers had originally seen. The bicycles along the ridge were only a fraction of the full site, which included dozens of objects swallowed by the trench.